Brenden Nunes, our Sactown Sports Kings insider. Brenden, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Allen. Excuse me. I moved yesterday, so I'd like to take full blame for the De'Aaron Fox trade happening yesterday.
Yeah.
I knew when I had this scheduled that, it was, of course, going to line up this way. But I'm doing all right, hanging in there. How you doing?
No, well, it's funny because when everything started to heat up, we both got the information. Hey, something is happening. I'm going to set up for the live show. And, I'm in my, I'm not in my PJs, but I'm in some, I've got to comb the hair and do a couple things. So I'm getting everything set up. As I'm refreshing, I walk to go put a shirt on, right? I go to the bedroom to put a shirt on, get the text from Chris Verlade. Well, there it is. And of course, as soon as I walk away from the setup, so then I got to rush and set everything up, but that's just how it goes. How did the move go? Just quickly. I know moving stinks.
It was all right. It wasn't too bad. I don't have a crazy amount of things going from a roommate to roommate scenario. So just moving a room isn't all too bad. It took 2 days. Trade news broke while I was on the road, had my girlfriend swap to the driver's seat, whip up an article real quick,
There you go.
Typical life of.
There you go. And look, speaking of whipping up an article, go check out Brendan's work on SactownSports.com. Okay, Brenden, let's get to it. And a lot of people started off, I've been calling this an Instagram trade because it looks really good as far as a picture is concerned. And Shams gets to come out and say, they got 3 first rounders, but you start to break down the first rounders and the value of them, not as high as maybe a lot of people would have liked. What were your first initial feelings on the trade?
Yeah, I mean, not too surprised that they tried to flip some of these assets for another player here. I thought that Devin Vassell or, probably not Stephon Castle. Obviously, that's what Sacramento would prefer, but I don't think San Antonio was really playing around with Castle very much there. But I was a little surprised that, no Keldon Johnson, no Devin Vassell in the deal. The picks that are coming back, essentially with the Charlotte pick being lottery protected this year and then turning into 2 Charlotte seconds, which isn't horrible, 2026 and 2027. But what you're talking, these are probably top 40 picks, obviously, right? So you get 2 seconds or 2 firsts essentially and 5 seconds in this deal. I think the decision to try and remain competitive makes trading away what is largely viewed as your best player a little bit complicated. That's not typically the scenario that those teams are usually in. So, there is aspects where I think the Kings will be better off offensively. They don't shoot very many threes. They don't knock them down at a great percentage. LaVine is shooting above 44% off the dribble and off the catch from 3. He gets up a crazy amount of games. So there's intriguing aspects, but I think overall it's an end of an era in Sacramento. And I think that De'Aaron was the best player on this team. So you got to rework a lot here. And I worry more about what this means for maybe your postseason odds rather than regular season numbers.
Let's go in that direction then, Brenden, and take a step back. Talking to Brenden Nunes, our Sactown Sports Kings insider. How will you remember De'Aaron Fox and what he did for the Sacramento Kings?
Yeah, I think that, from everything I've gathered, like De'Aaron really wanted to be in Sacramento and wanted it to work out here, and obviously we got to a point where maybe that wasn't the case because of just everything that happened over the years. I think from a Kings fan's perspective, they've grown frustrated, whether that be with this front office or just organization in general over the years. And I would just say being a player where your livelihood is on the line and dealing with all that, that's probably amplified even more so. And so I think that, a guy that wanted to be here when it came down to it, but it just didn't work out. And I think that San Antonio is a good spot for him eventually, but I think that original Beam team will always be remembered for a long time. Kevin Huerter does go into that grouping as well, but De'Aaron really being the one to pull this team essentially out of the gutters with that losing streak and playoff drought that they had experienced. I think that he'll be remembered fondly for a long time, but I think Zach LaVine could become a fan favorite pretty quickly.
Talking to Brenden Nunes, our Sactown Sports Kings insider. Brenden, when did you feel, or when did it feel like this thing was too far gone? We talked to Jason Anderson, and he said, after that OKC just dismantling of the Sacramento Kings, De'Aaron spent a lot of time in the locker room, and it kind of felt like it was headed in that direction. But we can take a step back from that. When did you feel like, yeah, I don't think this thing is going to pull itself back together, and Fox is probably gone?
Yeah, I think when they let go of Mike Brown, and it's again accumulation of things over the years, but in my mind, that was the final straw that
Mhm.
meant this offseason is probably the end. I didn't think it was going to be the deadline until, sort of this week leading up to it. But definitely day of and days prior, there was a lot of smoke of the Kings looking in a lot of different directions. Obviously, they came to De'Aaron saying that they thought that they were going to entertain conversations, and he had his response, and Rich Paul and all of that obviously factoring in there. But really, it seemed like they were trying everything, for all the names that were floated out there, whether it be Jimmy Butler for half a sec and then not going in that direction, or shoot, Alan, we heard the name like Kevin Durant floated around
Yeah.
for half a sec about the idea of, hey, what if we keep De'Aaron and we go and try and make these moves? And then eventually they revisit moving on from De'Aaron, obviously. And I even heard an aspect of, the front office somewhat feeling like it was hard to get other things done before moving De'Aaron. And, you think of the John Collins deal that they've been linked to, or Cam Johnson that they've been heavily linked to. They didn't have very many assets to work with when it
Right.
came to draft capital. And after this, sure, you can argue about the value level of each of these assets, but they have more to work with in general. I mean, they're working with, matching salary, maybe a different story after Kevin Herter's moved on from as well, but you still have Trey Lyles, some of these other pieces there. But they're working with 4 first-round picks, 2 swaps, and 6 second rounders now. It was 1 second rounder prior. Like John Collins is a guy that you wonder, if you throw 3 second rounders, can you get something done there? Or
Mhm.
again, now you have an interesting aspect to go revisit Cam Johnson trades, where maybe in an unprotected first down the line wasn't something you were willing to give up. But hey, this San Antonio pick that we have here, we feel a little bit more willing to give up, kind of like you see the Spurs trading one of their firsts for multiple lesser valued first in what everybody thought was going to be eventually a Jimmy Butler deal. So I think the writing is on the wall that they got more assets here to try and do more before this deadline.
Talking to Brenden Nunes, our Sactown Sports Kings insider. Brenden, how would you, going back to everything that happened with De'Aaron, how would you, for lack of a better term, distribute the blame? When De'Aaron, and we've talked about this a little bit during the roundtable, when De'Aaron and his camp approached the front office, right? When they approached the front office and said, hey, what are we doing here before it, whether I'm able to get the Supermax or not? Are we moving in the right direction? I think one thing that I'm struggling with, and what some of the listeners are struggling with, is whether or not was that all done in good faith when De'Aaron said, hey, this is the situation. For the Kings to move off of Mike Brown, right? Pretty soon after that happened, it's kind of telling me that they didn't think that conversation went really well. How would you distribute that blame? And do you think there was enough to keep De'Aaron before they decided to move off of Mike Brown? Do you think that they were a John Collins away? I think that's been the struggle here with the whole situation. Was there realistically enough for the Kings to do this season? Or was De'Aaron kind of saying, hey, go do all this stuff, but in reality, you're not going to be able to make up for all the screw-ups that you've had throughout the last 7 years?
Yeah, for sure. Again, I think the writing was on the wall. I think it would have taken a lot. I think it would have taken to keep De'Aaron around after the firing of Mike Brown. Again, there's that. I mean, honestly, I think the organization not having a press conference after doing that, and De'Aaron taking a lot of the blame, and him having to, maybe not having to, but feeling like he needs to take to socials to defend himself for doing that through media. Like, there's a couple aspects of that sort of stuff throughout the years, whether, he got blamed for when Keon Ellis was coming out after press conferences when they got their butt kicked. I believe it was in Boston. Yeah, this is like 2 years ago. De'Aaron gets a bunch of crap for it. Come to find out, he never even got asked to come out to post-game media, and he takes a bunch of crap for it, and the media doesn't, or the organization doesn't quite, stick their neck out to defend him. And so I think, again, I'm just throwing out a couple examples, but I think it's a buildup of things of drafting guards in the lottery for a couple years now, with Keegan Murray being the obvious exception. But I think really feeling like, looking at this roster the same way that we do from De'Aaron's perspective, but feeling like they need more wings forwards on this team to be serious.
Right.
And the organization didn't go get that. So I think that, could it have been saved at the deadline? Like, I think that's why you hear, and again, I think this was super pie in the sky, but that's why you hear like the KD stuff, because I think it would have had to been that extreme to convince De'Aaron to stay. And maybe it is a John Collins or Cam Johnson deal because that makes you have a very competitive second round exit. Like there's no telling that couldn't have been enough. But I think that he was at a point where he was pretty much over it and it would have taken a lot. And so from the Kings perspective, it's debatable if their same assets and return would have been available for them this offseason compared to doing the deal now, obviously. But again, you have more assets to work with at this deadline. And I don't think that they're done. But I think we had gotten to the point after the Mike firing and, again, accumulation of a lot of different things where it would have taken a lot to convince De'Aaron to stay at this point.
Brenden, one more quick one. I know we have you for 2 segments, and we'll kind of go into the future of the Kings on the other side. But I was just thinking about this as you were talking, and there's a game tonight, and we know that on top of everything that's been going on with the deal not being official yet, Zach LaVine and his wife, they just had a baby, so he hadn't been with the Bulls, so we don't know when we're going to see Zach LaVine. If I ask you initially who is the leader of the Kings right now, or who is the leader now of the Kings, what would you say?
Gosh, honestly, Allen, I hadn't thought about that. That's a good question. Well, to be honest, De'Aaron was already a lead by example guy.
Yeah.
So I think vocally it was more probably Domantas Sabonis and Malik Monk is almost like the spirit of the team. If you want to go in that direction, I think his energy is a little bit infectious. I think LaVine is going to have a little bit of that as well. And DeMar, obviously, you would like to think can be a little bit more comfortable here without having, I know it's the first coaching change mid-season he's dealt with, but having LaVine around who he has a good relationship with and just the monkey being off your back of all this De'Aaron Fox conversation, obviously. So it's a good question. I think it's kind of a team effort and you really look at, those main 4 guys on the roster and obviously interim Doug Christie too.
Yeah. It'll be fascinating to see who kind of emerges throughout the rest of this season, because the season ain't done and there's a game tonight. Let's talk about what the Kings are going to attempt to do before the trade deadline ends. And Brenden will break down kind of the flexibility that everybody keeps talking about the Kings having when we return. Brenden Nunes, our Sactown Sports Insider, hanging with us for another segment. Allen Stiles, Sactown Sports.
Breaking Sacramento.
From the 916, LaVine is a top 5 trade talent all time for the Kings. Top 5 trade talent. That's maybe, sure. Brenden Nunes. Brenden, what do you think of that? We're with Brenden Nunes, our Sactown Sports Kings Insider. Zach LaVine is a top 5 trade talent all time. So anybody that the Kings have traded for.
Sure. I think that's fair.
Right?
I also don't think it's the most prestigious list.
Right.
As we kind of go down the line.
Because DeMar is on that list.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like he was also used as the best free agent signing in Sacramento history. Right. So I guess he can go both ways as a sign and trade. But yeah, I mean, LaVine has a extensive resume. He's a gold medalist. How many times All-Star are we talking here? 2-time All-Star, but a guy that averages 24 this year. And yeah, I mean, he's a talented guy. And like I said, it's not the most prestigious list. So I'm
doing the list here. I can think of 5 players who were either Ring of Honor players or Brad Miller. So I think might not make the top 5, but he's top 10 maybe.
There you go. We'll take that. Brenden Nunes, our Sactown Sports Kings Insider. Okay, Brenden, we were texting about this a little bit before the show. And can you help the listeners and myself, to be completely honest? I put this out on social media. One person we haven't talked about is Kevin Huerter. So can you talk about the Zach LaVine trade kicker situation, the TPE, the trade player exception, why the Kings didn't lose anything, even though they moved off of Kevin Huerter and lost that contract because of the TPE? Can you kind of give a breakdown into how the flexibility that the Kings have with that money moving forward?
Yeah, so obviously a little bit complicated, but going to Chicago in this deal is Kevin Huerter, and the Kings are getting back Zach LaVine there, obviously. So a difference in salary there that gives Chicago a TPE. But from the San Antonio side, you're moving De'Aaron Fox and Jordan McLaughlin, obviously, to San Antonio, and you're only getting Sidi Sissoko back. So you're getting a extensive traded player exception there in return. But how these deals work, and also I think an important aspect of this is that this trade hasn't been finalized yet.
Right.
I'm sure that the other teams have incentives to try and get this done sooner rather than later, specifically San Antonio, obviously getting the biggest active player in this deal. But the Kings could look to expand this, and these TPEs could fail to exist down the line because, again, this deal is not finalized, and they could try to maneuver things within the aspects of this deal before they make the call to the league. But essentially, when you're sending more salary to teams than what you are getting back, there are also TPEs involved here. And the Kings have a couple notable ones with a 16.8 million now, 12.8 million as well, and another TPE, and some smaller ones floating around the 6 million mark that I believe that they've had sitting there as well. Again, as long as this deal stays as currently reported and expected at this point. But the complication there is that you can't aggregate other salaries with these TPEs. You can't combine Trey Lyles 8 million plus this 16 million, and all of a sudden you're up to 24. You would have to absorb a player straight up into that TPE, and obviously you would send out some other assets as well there. So that's why I think that, keeping an eye on them potentially expanding this deal rather than just straight up absorbing somebody, because the Collins money doesn't fit into that TPE. The Cam Johnson money doesn't fit into those TPEs quite. So that's why I think expanding the deal is something to keep tabs on a little bit, but those TPEs are definitely something to work with. And again, they just have more flexibility after making this Fox deal as the Thursday deadline approaches.
Talking to Brenden Nunes, our Sactown Sports Kings insider. Brenden, what are your thoughts on Zach LaVine as a fit? I'm kind of worried a little bit about the Malik Monk, Zach LaVine thing. They both need the ball and shoot the ball a good bit. That's the only thing that kind of stuck out in my mind. What's your thought on the Zach LaVine fit?
Yeah, I think offensively that this team's going to be really good. I think that they kind of have the same weaknesses that they already did. And you're minus another, what I thought was pretty good perimeter defender in De'Aaron Fox. And by the way, I think his defense is going to look even better, obviously, when you have a backline like Wemby and get to be even more aggressive at the point of attack there, something that he never had in Sacramento. But I think that offensively, this team's going to be talented. It's just tough when you come off. I know it was OKC, number one team in the West, but they're kind of known for their defense. Not that they can't score, don't have the leading scorer on their team, but they just dropped 144 on your head. And that was a team that looked like they kind of checked out. There's all these rumors going on. I think that there could be a new energy around this group, similarly to when you saw they made the swap from Mike Brown to Doug Christie, kind of just a new spark with the team, a weight off their shoulders almost in a way. But I think that this team's going to be a bucket. Like they're almost Bulls West in a way, but there was no Malik Monk. Don't say that. I think there are differences because there was no Malik Monk in Chicago, and there was Domantas Sabonis is a better player than Nikola Vucevic. Domas, I think his biggest skill is making the players around him better, and I think that we're going to see the best version of Zach LaVine that we've seen throughout his career in Sacramento here. He's a guy that's already putting up career numbers, I would guess, with a little motivation of trying to be like, hey, remember, I can do this. Somebody come save me a little bit. And obviously the Kings were the team to do that. But 44% from three on 7.3 a game for a Kings team that's flirting with bottom 5 in attempts and 3-point percentage. Like that helps your offense. I just think defensively, you probably got even worse. And that was already your struggle. And you still don't have the wings forwards that, was part of De'Aaron's frustration on his way out the door. So again, why I think that there's probably more coming here, at least. I think that's the only way this makes sense.
Brenden, are you surprised that, and obviously the money and then all the details there maybe didn't make this thing very easy, but again, getting Zach LaVine, and I know it's a 3-team deal and there are a lot of moving parts, but to your point, to even get Zach LaVine and I don't know, a Patrick Williams from the Bulls, are you surprised that the Kings didn't get, and look, we'll see what happens with CD Sissoko. I mean, he's a young guy, 20 years old, but are you surprised that the Kings weren't able to get another player back that we know can play in the NBA?
Player-wise, a little bit, but I think that when you're going after that, other star player, if we're calling LaVine that, which I think is probably fair, that that's going to be your main piece when it comes to active players. I think I was a little more surprised by the draft capital that the Spurs own, and this is in the DeMar DeRozan sign-in trade, which funnily enough was a 3-team deal with these exact same 3 teams, where San Antonio ended up with a 2031 swap from the Kings. I was surprised they couldn't get that back. Also, their best assets were these Atlanta picks that they got the DeJounte Murray trade. DeJounte Murray not even on the Hawks anymore, but they have an Atlanta unprotected pick this year that looks very interesting. I think that has a lot of value around the league, especially with Jalen Johnson going out. And I want to say the other one is in 2027 as well. Like they didn't get some of San Antonio's most valuable picks here. The 2031 Minnesota is intriguing. We'll see what happens with Ant at that point. But I think that's where I was more surprised by the return, because when you're trying to get another star, I get that that's going to be your main piece here. Some of the other things are going to look a little bit worse. But I would have hoped that their draft capital would have been a little bit better than what's essentially these 2 firsts and 5 seconds. But, I've also talked to people that thought with how everything is laid out and De'Aaron essentially saying, hey, it's San Antonio or nothing, which I got the same thing, that, maybe not the worst return, but I personally think it's the decision to try and remain competitive while, going through all this that maybe just makes it a little complicated.
Brenden, before we get you out of here, what are your thoughts and what are you hearing as far as the potential other moves for the Kings? Is it a backup center, the Allen Stiles thing? Is it still that wing? I know I had heard playmaker and a wing. Is that what you're hearing? Is it back to the Cam Johnsons and John Collins situation? Any other names being thrown in the pile? What are you hearing?
Yeah, I think there's definitely reason to believe that the conversations that they previously had could be reignited. I think it makes a lot of sense for them to go back for Cam Johnson, a guy that they've been known to really like. Again, we have until Thursday here, so the time's ticking there, and everybody in the league seems to expect Cam Johnson to be on another team here. So I would guess that Sacramento's probably part of that bidding war, and they have more to work with now. Same, go back to John Collins. But I think that they could go in a handful of different directions here. And with Kevin Huerter's matching salary being gone, Trey Lyles was the other one there that you kind of expect to be part of a potential deal here. And that leaves you with the backup center a little bit open. You have Alex Len, but Trey Lyles also fills that role a bit. And he's one of the few forwards on this team that plays on a nightly basis. So I think that's where you enter the backup center conversation as well. But that could be more, complementary smaller pieces. It could be Day'Ron Sharp connected to, like, I've heard the idea of him also being part of a Cam Johnson trade, right. A young backup center there as well. So I think the backup center is something that is easier to figure out, and more so the highlight would be, don't be surprised to hear them revisit the same conversations that what we've been having for 2 years, Alan. But now they got more to work with.
Now they got more to work with now, but you also don't have De'Aaron Fox. Well, we're glad we have you, Brenden Nunes, our Sactown Sports Kings insider. Be sure to check out all of Brendan's work on SactownSports.com and follow him on social media. Brenden, thank you so much for joining us.
Appreciate you, Alan.
That was Brenden Nunes. On the other side, Jeff Garcia, Spurs beat reporter and host Locked On Spurs, also does work for KENS 5 TV in San Antonio. He joins us on the other side. Allen Stiles, Sactown Sports.
Monday